fabulous speakers for you today, and I'm sure it's going to be really interesting for us all to hear what they've all got to say. I'm going to hand you over to James Craigie now, who's going to chair the meeting, and he's going to introduce our first speaker. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks all again for coming out. Firstly, I'd like to thank the GMB and the Socialist Environment Resource Association for helping organise today, and Unite the Union for hopefully taking this session of talks about carbon neutral Torridge across for the next sort of 12 months. And of course, most thanks goes to Joe Day, who probably you've all read in the newspaper over the last 2 weeks, has done so much to make sure that this area does become carbon neutral by 2030, not least by getting Bideford Town Council to sign up to it. It just leaves me to sort of introduce Dr. Alan Whitehead, who is the Labour spokesperson in energy and climate change. And he's been a campaigner for the environment since the 70s, and even before becoming an MP, he was in Southampton City Council, helping it to become more self-sustaining, and even the Southampton Civic Centre, getting it heated by geothermal, I understand. But since becoming an MP, he really has worked very hard in the House of Commons to support becoming more carbon neutral by promoting renewable energies, particularly microgeneration, domestic microgeneration. And in 2005, he introduced a private members' bill to make the 2030 carbon neutral deadline a legal requirement for Britain. Sadly, that bill was talked out by, you can guess it, the Tories. But a lot of the work that he's done has been incorporated into sort of particularly the Labour government's bills, acts on environment and climate change, and obviously he's done quite a lot of work in promoting it through the Socialist and Environment Resource Association, and basically I'll now invite him to explain why we need to be sort of carbon neutral by 2030 and why it's such an important time that we've got basically 10, 11 years to get our act together. Thank you.
Well, good morning everybody, and I hope you can hear me. We haven't got a PA here this morning, and the other affliction I have to tell you is that I've got a bit of the Theresa May. That doesn't mean I've turned obstinate and I refuse to listen to everybody. So, it means that my voice might pack up halfway through the proceedings. So I'll have to sort of wave slides at you or whatever for the rest of where we go to this morning in the event that occurs, but we'll see how we go. I'm really delighted to have been invited to come and talk to you today. And that's because I know that what you are active in and have been doing are a series of positive things about what we do about climate change. And that is, as far as I'm concerned, my prime function in the House of Commons at the moment is actually shaping and promoting and pushing the policies of actually doing something about it, rather than going on. I'm not saying you shouldn't go on about the climate emergency we're in at the moment, but the absolute key at the moment is to fashion the ways we're going to have to work in the future, the ways the low carbon economy is going to have to go, the way we're going to have to live on a low carbon basis, in order that across the board we have got to a position where we have not just a temporary low carbon world, but a sustainable low carbon world, so that everything we do, as far as our lives are concerned, reflects that low carbon imperative. And that's going to require an enormous amount of things to be done at national level, at international level, but predominantly at local level in terms of refashioning how we live our lives. And obviously, unless all those go together, if there are gaps in the process, then it doesn't work. So it's about getting our whole lives low carbon in the future. And I hope I'm sure I'm here today with a very supportive group who want to see that happen. But I suppose I ought to check before we start. Are there any climate change deniers in the House today? No? Good, right. Okay. So we don't need to go through the first bit then, do we? But where I want to start is actually where we are as far as our international commitments are concerned, and how that feeds down to what it is we've got to do as far as the UK is concerned. So we are in a position where the Paris COP, the climate summit, several years ago, COP21 I think it was, actually came up with a new way of looking at national commitments as far as climate change action was concerned. And previously we had, from Kyoto onwards, general commitments that people had to reduce according to their particular level of industrialisation and previous outputs as far as climate change gases and emissions were concerned, but not a really serious way of saying, right, what is it that you as a country, and each country is concerned, needs to get within in terms of emissions over the next period in order to contribute your fair share to those global emission reductions. And what Paris managed to do was to actually get, it's good news and bad news here, was actually get those indicative national contributions nailed down country by country coming into Paris, so that within those considerations of who done it in the first place and what the circumstances of particular countries were concerned, those emission contributions nailed down. Now obviously the next thing, and this has occupied the COPs after Paris, is to make those actually happen. And so that's where the bad news starts. The good news is that's now in place. The bad news is when all of those INDCs, as they're called, are put on the table at the moment, the net result across the world is that it comes to collectively about a 2.7 degree temperature increase by 2050, which obviously is way off what you need to get to, and even more way off what we now know we need to get to as far as the more recent IPCC report on temperature variation and climate change effects, and the fact that various of those effects are coming upon us much sooner and more ferociously than had been thought before. And therefore the indicative aspiration that was set out at Paris of thinking about going to 1.5 degree limitation across the world really becomes pretty much what you've got to do if you're going to have a reasonable chance of actually stabilising the climate to the extent that allows that low carbon series of arrangements to become sustainable in the long term. Now we know obviously that anthropogenic global warming is going to have huge ramifications even if we stopped putting any carbon into the into the air, or greenhouse gases into the air now, it would have tremendous ramifications for many years, but at least we would be in a position where that would start to go down over the period, and we would be in a position where the climate could be reasonably stabilised in the long term. So that makes the UK's indicative national contribution, at the time put through the European Union, ever more important in terms of we have got to make sure that we deliver our indicative national contribution. Firstly, so that everybody else delivers theirs, and secondly, although it is said that we're not an enormous carbon emitter as a country compared with the rest of the world, it's a crucial part of those emissions, and it's a crucial part of those emissions because we are such an industrialised country, and the process of actually doing that in the UK can actually be the template for how everybody else does that across the world. So it's vital we get that done, and that it's vital that we not only get to that target, but we actually move down towards that 1.5 degree target and work out what that means in terms of the increased contribution that we need to make from the UK as far as that overall target is concerned. And of course we are in a good position as far as that is concerned, in as much as we have available to us the world's first Climate Change Act, put in by the last Labour government, and I was modestly say I had quite a bit of a hand in that in terms of sitting on all the committees that passed it through, and the scrutiny arrangements that went through House of Lords. A bit of a larger version perhaps of making Bideford Council carbon neutral, but same principle. Getting that Climate Change Act in place, which, as I think everybody knows, works on the basis of the target up in front of us, which at that time was effectively the 2 degrees target, and a working out of what the UK's contribution that would be in terms of an overall carbon allowance, and then breaking that down into 5-year carbon budgets so that you progressively reduce the carbon emissions over the period of time, and then the next carbon budget progressively reduces those emissions still further, and so on and so on. And when that Climate Change Act was introduced, the Committee on Climate Change was set up, a very wise and influential body in terms of advising on what needs to be done, what the numbers look like, how we can get to the position we need to get to. But it is government that needs to actually do the things, and so each 5 years the Committee on Climate Change is supposed to produce a carbon budget with an outline of how that budget can be met, and also reports on where we are on those previous carbon budgets, and the government is then supposed to produce a plan for how to get to the end of that relevant carbon budget, what policies are going to be introduced. And the government is supposed to produce policies, and indeed the Committee on Climate Change is supposed to produce carbon budgets for 3 carbon budgets out. So we are now at the end of the period of the 3rd carbon budget. We're going into the 4th carbon budget, which is 2022 to 28, and the 5th carbon budget, 28 to 32. And what I will be, I guess, quite interested to know is, well, how have we done so far in our carbon budget? Again, there's good news and bad news. We've actually marginally overachieved on the first 3 carbon budgets in terms of carbon emission reductions. Now, arguably you could say, well, that's great news. We've carried out our carbon budgets, we're ahead of them if anything, so why can't we just now sit back and relax and borrow the gains we've got from the first 3 carbon budgets to say, well, we can take it a bit easy now? And the answer is no, we can't. Because one of the things about carbon budgets is that you've got to take the carbon progressively away over each period. Because if you think about it for a moment, you could, for example, just coast along where you are in terms of emissions, get to 2050, and then suddenly shut everything down, and you've got to the figure where you didn't have many carbon emissions. But meanwhile, there'd be a huge overhanging load of carbon emissions out there, which we put in the atmosphere over the previous 40 years. So it is quite unacceptable that you borrow from your carbon budgets to offset yourself for the future, which is actually a current debate in carbon budgets at the moment. So we've got to a position where we've overachieved on those budgets, and we've also partly overachieved on those budgets because we've taken all the low-hanging fruit. Things like the transition from coal power to gas power, very substantial climate change consequences, but you can only do that once. And so the 4th carbon budget, 5th carbon budget, the going gets much, much tougher. And what is a little, well, I say a little distressing, it is really worrying, is that in terms of what the government has now set out to achieve as far as the 4th and 5th carbon budgets are concerned, is actually not meeting those budgets. And they have put forward a what's called a clean growth plan. Used to be called a low carbon budget. The government has decided it's called a clean growth plan, and I think that gives you a bit of a clue as to what some of the policies in it are concerned with. But it's not that the policies aren't helpful mostly, it's just they don't do the job. We don't get anywhere near meeting the terms of the 4th carbon budget and the 5th carbon budget in terms of what we've got now nationally planned to carry those things out. And what is really pretty frightening is that whilst governments are supposed to produce plans which show how they will meet those carbon budgets, the present government has put forward plans which it crows about and says they're really great and really green plans, but in the middle of those plans themselves, they say we won't meet the carbon budgets. And not only won't we meet them, that they're going to be about 6% over for the 4th carbon budget and 9% over for the 5th carbon budget. So as things stand in terms of the policies for this country, we will grievously overshoot on our greenhouse gas low carbon targets. And actually, if you look at the difference between what the supposed reductions are between the 4th carbon budget and the 5th carbon budget, we only get halfway there. It's as bad as that. So we know at the moment that for all the talk that you get at the moment, well, you know, things are really going well, load of offshore wind being produced by the country at the moment, that's going to deal well with low carbon energy. The fact of the matter is we're nowhere near. So what we need now is a radical programme, quite frankly, to just get us back on track with those carbon budgets, get us back on track with the 4th carbon budget, get us back on track with the 5th carbon budget. And in looking at what that radical programme is going to look like, we need to understand where we are falling short as far as our climate change commitments are concerned.